Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Free Speech Forward podcast. Today, we have what's turning into another episode in a series where we're talking with some of the really, I'm going to refer to them as the illustrious leaders of the Free Black Thought movement. And today, we have Professor Jake Mackey with us to give us both his personal perspective and, I believe, some insights on free speech in education and academia. But I'm going to turn it over to my co host and my co founder, Chris, to tell you more about Jake, and we're going to get this conversation started.
Great. Thanks, Troy, and thanks, Jake, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great to have you. We're excited about this one. As we always do for our audience listening out there, we like to give some background on our guest. And Jake Mackey is a professor of classics at Occidental College on the West Coast, where he teaches Greek and Latin languages and literatures and their transformative reception by African American writers. He is faculty advisor for the Student Persuasion Club, which provides a space for the free exchange of ideas on campus. He's also the author of Belief in Cults, Rethinking Roman Religion, and a co-author and co-editor of The Poisoning of the American Mind. He is also a founding member of Free Black Thought, and we just recently learned he has a new book coming out later this year that he is co-authoring called Virtuous Nonsense, Progressive America's Epistemic Crisis, which I am already piqued an interest in want to read and learn more about. But for now, we'll turn it over to you to start off by telling us, how did you become a leader and advocate for free speech?
Well, thank you so much, and it's very flattering to be told that I'm a leader. I'm definitely an advocate for free speech. Gosh, how did it all start? I mean, there's a lot of strands to this. One of the strands that I think is really important is that I was brought up in what I regard as a cult. I was raised partly on an ashram in India, from the age of 5 to the age of 16, and it was as many cults are, it was a very repressive environment. And the first sort of freedom, one of the first pieces of your autonomy that you lost was your free speech. You couldn't talk about certain things. You couldn't be honest about what you were seeing happening in the cult. And this it was all that was all sort of enforced by a really intense program of social censure. You would just be completely ostracized. It was there would have been a kind of cancel culture before, avant la lettre put in place against you if you said what you actually thought or if you questioned anything. So that's from being a very young child, I um, chafed against limitations on my speech. And then, as I matured, when I became a teenager, I was very much on the left. I was really involved in the punk rock movement, punk. I was kind of an anarchist, actually. Um, and as a result, at that time, as an anarchist, I sort of took an anarchistic view towards speech, and I thought it should all be allowed. And I was well aware that causes on the left had always been furthered by unfettered speech, right? Like, for example, the civil rights movement, you know, um, John Lewis and others have remarked that the civil rights movement would have been impossible without freedom of speech, and that they were always coming up against censorship, and so and having to push and fight for more freedom of speech. So I was aware that freedom of speech was really important to make progress in, you know, the furtherance of rights, the rights of minorities and whatnot, and pushing back against injustice. I was also, of course, a teenager in the 1980s when there was a lot of censorship of music happening. There was the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource, was it Council or Center, started by Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, and some others, um, wanting to slap labels on records. There was the first ever, I believe, obscenity suit against music. Two Live Crew, this Florida rap band, had an album called As Nasty as They Wanna Be, which by today's standards was really tame. But at the time, some judge said that this was obscene music, and there were even instances where record store owners were arrested for selling the album. And so, just as a young person, growing up wanting to listen to that music, I was aware of being engaged in a kind of free speech battle. Um, so my interest in free speech is overdetermined. My whole life has been sort of, I've been, it's felt to me that I was always in the middle of some kind of free speech battle. And now, of course, I'm a college professor and, in the 21st century, and here we still are facing these free speech issues, but they seem to be very different. They now, certainly from my point of view, the place that I see it the worst is in academia. And, that's just because I'm in academia, I suppose. I see it, I feel it. But, academia is an extremely unfree place. And there are there are both informal and formal speech codes on campuses, on campuses, people feel, I have, I have now talked to, I can't even count how many colleagues who won't say what they actually think because they recognize that there is an informal process, an informal pressure against them saying that, and that they will be ostracized, they'll lose their standing, they're just afraid to talk. And then there's formal ones too, right? You have on most campuses, you now have bias response teams where if someone says something that someone takes badly, it doesn't have to be overt racial slurs or something. It can just be a microaggression, So if someone says something that someone takes badly, they can report them to this bias response team, which will then investigate and, re-educate them or whatever they do. So, we live in, repressive times for speech, and I can't not be involved. So that's where I'm coming from.
One of the things that strikes me about your story is just how dramatic the swings across this spectrum were. I feel we have to call this episode something like From the Ashram to Anarchy to Academic Censure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah,
the,
yeah.
so much of this experience. So I'm curious, just based on all of this lived experience that you have gone
Hmm.
through, what would you say to people who argue against free speech, or at least stand up for it? I'm not sure they're always making arguments, but what would be your argument as to why free speech is so important to flourish as both an individual and for our society as a whole?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there are. I'm glad you divided it up that way for an individual and for society as a whole, because I do think that the kind of animal we are rational animals capable of you know reason, thought, capable of analyzing arguments, making arguments. I think for an animal like that to take away that free speech, it would be akin to taking away, the wings from a bird or the claws from a cat. I mean, this is just it's what we do uh, is uh, think, have freedom of conscience, and that was necessarily um, going to be externalized in free speech. And so, anytime you're suppressing speech, you're also suppressing, the individual's sort of freedom of conscience. You're suppressing their ability to think, to reason, because you're forcing them to hide it. You're forcing them to repress it and keep it inside. So I just think, yeah, essentially we're a kind of creature that needs free speech needs the freedom to speak in order to thrive and to flourish. And so then as a society, well, we're also a deeply social animal, and we human beings reason together. They get together, and a lot of our reasoning takes place collectively. We don't do a lot of it just alone in our head. We do it in dialogically with one another. A lot of our best thinking is done when we are exchanging ideas, and the ideas are growing, transforming, being refined in this back and forth. And so, because we are a kind of creature that thinks and reasons in dialogue with one another, anytime you suppress speech, you suppress our ability to do what we're built to do, which is to engage in that kind of open and honest and freewheeling dialogue, you know? So that's, I just think it's incredibly, it goes against our nature
Mm.
to have our speech repressed, which is not to say that, I think it's also in our nature to try to suppress speech. I really do think that it's not. I mean, it wasn't invented by some totalitarian and then forced on us. I think we don't like to hear things that, that go against what we deeply believe. We don't like to hear things that seem to upset the social order, especially if we're doing pretty well because of the social order, And so it's natural to want to say, "Hey, shut up," you know. And so, and then that urge to say, "Hey, shut up," gets institutionalized in government and whatnot. And yeah, so all these things I think are natural to us, but I think we have to fight that darker urge to suppress speech, and we have to embrace and foster this urge, this inherent urge, I think, that's in us to let speech be free. And I think we do better as individuals and as a society when we do that. You know?
I like how you connected it to our nature, and kind of
Yeah,
that
I think so.
foundational aspect. I mean, it's somewhat implicit even in the way we constructed this question, which you I think noticed of why it's important to both of us as individuals and as a society is that we certainly start from a recognition of that same nature, that we're both individual and social creatures. So it
Mm-hmm.
does matter for both,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why we even started this podcast, was to champion the importance of this as fundamental to our nature. So
Absolutely.
I think you're the first person to really kind of put it in those metaphysical terms, which
Mm-hmm.
both of us being philosophically minded, as we were chatting before we recorded, it definitely fits. So I guess to that end, and especially given what you just said about how we also tend to kind of by nature or knee jerk want to restrict others' speech, like, can you give some tips or pointers at how people can better communicate their ideas effectively, maybe perhaps by drawing on some of your own experience when you prepare to articulate your own ideas, either through writing, a speech, any other public forum?
Sure. And I'm not always as good at this as I should be, but it's a
That's all right.
work
We're
in
all a work in
progress.
progress. Yeah,
Exactly,
exactly.
exactly. I'm trying. I'm working on it. But so as I mentioned, I mean, I think it's natural to us to want to shut down speech that offends us or that we feel threatened by, something that threatens our deepest values, our beliefs, some norms that we hold as really important. And so to avoid triggering that response in someone you're talking to, someone you're addressing, an interlocutor, an audience, to avoid triggering that repressive kind of response, I think a really important technique for people in the sort of free speech space is to attempt to find the values that you do share with your audience, with your interlocutor, with your dialogue partner, and put those front and center. Lead with, here's what we share now. And given and then establishing this rapport and this connection and this, just this sense of solidarity around certain shared values, you then say, you know, given these values now, let me just offer you this thought. Let me run this by you to see what you think about it. And that's when you offer the challenging thing. And I think once you've established that you do share certain values and you're not natural enemies, you're not like the wolf and the lamb or something. Once you've established that rapport, that the challenging new thought that you have, the challenging new proposal can be better received and it can be received as less threatening, you know? And I think that's what you saw the best communicators just historically have done. I think it's obvious that MLK was great at that, right? He would so stirringly invoke the shared values of what it means to be an American, and these were very liberal values, right? These classically liberal values, and then he would often show, now here's a way in which we as a country are not living up to these values. Here's a given that we share these values, let me challenge you on this particular uh, topic or issue. And I think that was how he was able to be heard, rather than if he had just sort of started off by, you know, assailing people for what they were doing wrong. So
Mhm.
again, I'm not always the best at that, but it is something I strive for, and it's something I recommend to people.
Well, one of the values we champion here is kind of learning and practicing from all of these experiences, and even continuing to improve ourselves. So, I'm very much of the belief that we all are can continually improve on these areas. So it's certainly not here to be experts on this subject per se, but that we're trying to model these better communication and other free speech skills ourselves as well, and promote those. So especially in today's cancel culture, which you alluded to, on academia, and then just the social media scrum, it does kind of it even despite the best of us, it can drag us into some of that mudslinging. But I think that's a great principle to return to and remind
Hmm.
us all is finding meeting people where they are and finding that shared value system.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, oh, go ahead, Joy. Were you going to say something?
No, no, you're doing perfectly. I just wanted to say here, and I think this idea of being able to join in solidarity, so the person knows you're challenging the idea and not the person. So it's almost, you're forming a collaboration to explore the idea together instead of
Hmm. Hmm.
two
That's
two
great.
people or two groups against each other. I I, I
That's
really like that strategy.
that's such a great way to put it. That if you can take the adversarialness out of the conversation, if you can make it not it's not something where one of us is going to win and the other one's going to lose, but it's a shared collaboration and exploration. Now, that's not always going to be possible, especially around heated topics that are get people really hot, and where there's clearly an adversarial sort of, it's like it's clearly either A or B, and there's no middle ground. You know, you can't always do that, but that's an absolutely a great sort of model to aspire to. Yeah.
Well, and perhaps maybe that I don't know if that at all would relate to your thoughts on this next question, but one we always like to ask our guests is, if resources weren't a constraint, what do you think would be the most impactful initiative to invest in to promote a better free speech culture?
I think it's all about the kids at this point. I'm as a college teacher and as a parent of young children, um, what I see is very alarming. And so, when I was a teenager, the sort of culture of free speech, as a kind of teen culture, something that was embraced by young people, it was incredibly strong. We all, at least as Gen Xers, we all sort of felt the urgency of protecting free speech. And I think there's been a war waged against that. And I think it's been waged for decades now. And unfortunately, I think it's been primarily waged from the left. I think there are plenty of right wing threats to free speech, but I don't think they have succeeded in capturing the youth the way the left has. And I think arguments that have been made in feminist discourse. I think of Catherine McKinnon, um, arguments from critical race theory. I think of Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado. These authors I've mentioned have books from the early 90s arguing for the suppression of speech in order to prevent harms to people. And so this message that there are victims of speech, innocent victims of speech who are weak, and they're in a minority position, they're in a powerless position, and they need to be protected from the harms of speech. This is over the last 30, 35 years, this message has been, I think, uh, has reached our kids really, really successfully. And I think I think it's a kind of default position now for Gen Z, and so they are actually, I think Gen Z is often quite suspicious of free speech, and it's sort of right wing coded to them. And if you bring it up, there's a kind of knee jerk. Oh well, what do you mean? You mean people just get to yell racial epithets and that kind of thing? And that's not what it means. Well, what is it you're not free to say? Is it your homophobia, your transphobia, your racism? No, 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 that's not what we're talking about. But that's become the kind of this idea that truly free speech means harming victims, innocent victims, with your words. This has really taken over for the kids. So what would I do if money cost were no object? If I could just had all the money in the world and I could do whatever I want? I would try to initiate some kind of nationwide program to re-ground young people in the importance of this foundational American ideal, right? That's there from the very beginning in the Constitution and the First Amendment to the Constitution, and try to uh, address their reasonable concern that totally unfettered speech with no sort of social norms, uh, you know mitigating it in any way whatsoever. Yeah, there could be cases where a school, a workplace could devolve into some kind of just a place where minorities are relentlessly victimized by slurs and verbal assaults. Try to address that kind of concern that they have, but also show why it actually shouldn't be their overriding concern, and it shouldn't be a concern that causes them to limit speech in some way. So really, I would try to instigate some kind of nationwide program that would seek to reinstill in young people an appreciation for the value of free speech and try to address the concerns that they do have. And I'm not sure how one would go about that, but you would obviously have to get buy-in from schools, probably from
Mm-hmm.
major media,
Mm-hmm.
organizations. Yeah. So,
It's definitely a multi institutional or multi front
yeah.
effort you would need to. But yeah, I mean, a society wide effort to reaffirm the value of free speech, right, and including speech that one does find offensive, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like that. I like how you tied it back to critical theory, which I'm a little familiar with, just kind of how it rooted that, the objective is to avoid harm, and that speech
Yeah.
is equated with harm as if it's almost
Hmm.
physical harm, and that obviously is a very anti-American, illiberal idea, an
Yes.
ideal. Unfortunately, it is kind of dominant, but it is one that I think we as champions of free speech need to excise from people's thinking in order to
Yeah.
kind of regain some of that culture of free speech and valuing of it, because you know
Yeah.
as the saying goes, I detest what you say, but I'll uphold till the death your right to say it, right? I mean, that is the true liberal creed, and that you counter bad speech with better speech, not by
Hmm.
suppressing
Hmm.
it. So
Yeah.
perhaps that may be a good. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I mean that's the suppression. If you try to suppress it, you're gonna drive it into some kind of underground place where it actually festers and
Right,
gets worse.
right.
Yeah. So
Well,
that these, yeah,
yeah, and drawing both the metaphysical and the moral distinction between words and actions,
yeah,
right?
absolutely,
So that those two
yeah,
have been conflated, I think,
yeah,
purposefully for these illiberal ends. So,
absolutely.
so
And that's
perhaps
why I
that,
think that's why I think that this whatever this project is that I would use my unlimited money on, I mean, it really would have to be addressed to young people because that
yeah,
really
for
is
sure.
where this has taken hold the most, and it's really the frontier in the battle for free speech. I think is young, Gen Z and
Yeah.
younger, yeah.
Although interestingly, I feel like there are some signs of green shoots with Gen
Hmm.
Z, or maybe even,
Yep.
well, it's probably not Gen Alpha yet; they're too young, but
Yeah.
certainly with Gen Z. So we'll see. But that's a good, I think, segue into just the final thoughts
Mm.
here. Is any words of encouragement that you either do give to your students already, or that you would give in a forum like this to people looking to stand up and share their ideas and their voice in our kind of censorious culture, like you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. People have a lot at stake, you know. Um, it's easy for me now. I have to be very aware of the fact that I am now, as of 2022, a tenured professor, which means it's a lot harder to fire me, which means I can say things that offend my colleagues and offend students, and um, people just sort of have to deal with it. But not everyone's in. That's an extremely privileged position, to use sort of today's lingo, and not everyone's in that position, and people have to worry about their livelihood and whatnot. So I would say to everyone to weigh out the costs and benefits, and of speaking in a completely unfettered kind of way. And you have to take into account, do you have a family to support? How secure is your job, et cetera, et cetera. But, once you've done that, once you've made the kind of calculus, I think people sort of absolutely should lean into speaking out and to finding their voice and to standing up. And I think here's one thing I'll say to people when they're making the calculus: it will often appear to you that you're a lone voice, and that the world is against you, and that you're the only one who feels this way, and that if you speak out, the entire world is going to jump on you and try to destroy you. But the fact is, probably you're surrounded by other people who feel just the same way you do, but they too feel alone. And there's a phenomenon that's it's kind of from game theory. It's a collective action problem where you know um, if you think you're the only one with the heterodox view, um, you won't be emboldened to speak out. But as soon as you do speak out, as soon as those around you realize, whoa, I'm not the only one. She feels that way too. There's this effect, a kind of domino effect, where as soon as you speak out, it emboldens other people to join you in speaking out, and you can sort of solve the collective action problem by being brave enough to be the first one to say something. And you can go gently. You can test the waters. Don't just stand up immediately one day and put your unvarnished thoughts out there. you know, Ask around, people you trust, say, hey, let me run something by you. How do you feel about this? And you can build a kind of circle of allies.
Mm.
This is a piece of advice I do have for people: is start with the people you most trust and sort of try to build a circle of allies. And then once you do feel supported, once you have some kind of community supporting you, then you can speak out more vocally and gauge the reaction. And yeah, there will be people who will be angry. You may have people try to cancel you, but you also may actually grow that community of supporters. And I've seen it. I've seen it happen time and again. So again, it's a serious thing. It's not without real risks. But I think if you approach the project of speaking out in a careful and sort of deliberate way, you might be surprised not only how easy it is, but how much of a difference you can make. So yeah,
Well put. Well, thank you for your time, Jake, and thanks for those thoughts. It was great to have you, and that completes our time for this week. We'll see everybody in 2 weeks. As always, you can find us under the Institute for Liberal Values Dissidents podcast page and at our website, 1776forward.com or ilvalues.org. Thank you.
thank you so much for having me.